Did you know that in 1825, for the first time ever, a man rode in an enclosed railway carriage pulled by a steam locomotive? And this was just the beginning of a transportation revolution that would change the world forever. And today we get to meet the man who made it possible, George Stephenson. Welcome to the channel. Now, if you've ever wondered about the very first train, well, wonder no more. George Stephenson is considered to be the father of the railways, and he was born in 1781 in the village of Recondite in the north of England. His father was a fireman and engine driver, and so from an early age, George was immersed in the world of steam engines. In fact, by the age of 14, he was working as a fireman himself, driving a coal-fired steam engine that pumped water out of a mine. But while his peers saw steam engines as nothing more than exciting toys, George was determined to improve them. He taught himself engineering and began experimenting with ways to make steam engines more efficient. One of his inventions was a stationary steam engine that could be used to power looms in textile factories. This invention earned him a reputation as a skilled engineer, and he was soon in charge of all the engines at the colliery where he worked. However, it wasn't long before George set his sights on something even bigger, literally. He wanted to build a locomotive that could pull carriages along a railway track. Now, you might think that this idea was completely original, but in reality, George was building on the work of many other engineers, including Richard Trevithick, who had built a steam locomotive that ran on rails. But Trevithick's engine was too heavy, and it kept breaking down. It also produced very little power, so it couldn't pull any carriages. By contrast, George Stephenson was obsessed with creating an engine that was not only reliable, but also powerful enough to haul heavy loads. He experimented with different designs and made several prototypes before finally creating an engine that he was satisfied with. He called it the Locomotion No. 1, and it was built in 1814. The engine had a low, wide firebox and a large driving wheel, which made it more stable than previous locomotives. It also had a piston valve, which allowed more steam to flow into the cylinders, producing more power. Now, you might be wondering, why didn't he just call it the Stephenson one? Well, that's because George was already thinking about the future. You see, he believed that there would eventually be so many different types of locomotives that they would need to be organized into classes. So he decided to name the first-class locomotion, with the second class being placed below it. And since he built two locomotion engines in 1814, the first one became known as Locomotion No. 1, while the second one was called Locomotion No. 2. But that still doesn't explain why he put the word rail in front of the name. Well, that was because he believed that his locomotives were destined to run on rails, or rather tramways, which were basically rails laid on the road. However, as you can probably guess, this plan didn't really work out. The roads were too bumpy, and the engines kept breaking down. That said, George hadn't given up on his dream of creating a railway network. So he teamed up with a mining engineer named John Burley, and together they built a railway line between two of Burley's collieries. The line was only 1.5 miles long, but it didn't matter. On September 27, 1825, George drove his engine, which he had nicknamed the Rocket, along the track, and it was a huge success. The wheels stayed on the track, the engine didn't break down, and it even pulled a passenger carriage. And so, that is how the railway age began. Within a few years, George's engines were hauling passengers and freight all over England, and soon after that, all over the world. But sadly, George never saw this happen. He died in 1848, but his legacy lived on. In fact, to this day, there are still Stephenson engines running around the world. And every year there is a festival held in his honor in the town of Ainley, where his first locomotive is preserved. So the next time you jump on a train, remember to thank George Stephenson, the man who made it all possible. And if you want to learn more about trains, stay tuned for more information.